Hi there, I'm Deep Dillon. Welcome to your AI Injection, the podcast where we discuss state-of-the-art techniques in artificial intelligence with a focus on how these capabilities are used to transform organizations, making them more efficient, impactful, and successful. So, hey, Kelsey, thanks so much for being here. Please set the context for our discussion. So what's the problem you all at Pachama are solving?
We at Pachama work on verifying forest carbon credits, which means we work in the space of nature-based solutions for carbon capture. And so the problem we're solving is verifying that these forests are as healthy and robust and real as everybody wants them to be.
As just a regular person, what does it mean to offset your carbon? What are the credits? And how does that link up to what you guys are monitoring?
Yeah. So at a basic level, everything we do all the time is emitting carbon, and we need to be not doing that so much. But forests and all kinds of ecosystems do a really great job of taking carbon out of the air through photosynthesis as these plants grow. So the idea behind a carbon credit is if you can quantify how much a forest is growing, you can figure out how much carbon is being sucked out of the air by that forest. Where this gets tricky is in order to be a real offset, it needs to be a forest that wouldn't have grown without that.
I was just going to say, how do you know that this wasn't just going to be there anyway?
There's several parts to our verification process, but part of it is we need to make sure that it's real. Like the forest that people claim is there is actually there. Mm-hmm. We need to make sure that it's additional. That means that the forest is either healthier or bigger, or trees are growing back in a healthier or faster way, or the deforestation they're claiming to prevent is actually being prevented. And that if what they're claiming is preventing deforestation, that it's not just like going somewhere else. Then we need to also make sure that it's permanent, meaning that we can understand like the risk of it being cut down or burning down or being hit by insects and take that into account when we're crediting it, so that if that were to happen, the credits could be redirected to a different forest or something like that. And then verifiable, meaning we can tell what kinds of trees are there and what kind of an ecosystem it is, and therefore can model how much carbon is in the trees, because generic forest, like the kind of forest you have in California versus Brazil, have very different characteristics of how much carbon is stored in them. And then finally, things about like impact beyond carbon, which is not modeled with AI. That part is just like our experts on the ground, making sure basically that when you have a forest project, it's doing good things for the forest, but you don't want it to be coming at the expense of an indigenous community or something. So we want to make sure that the projects are good as a whole rather than just looking at the carbon.
Got it. Here's my ideal vision, right? Like I want to be able to offset my carbon. I want to put in, let's say, for every X dollars I put in, I would know exactly what little plot of land and trees or what chunk of a tree I actually own. And I'd be able to, again, in a perfect world, have a real-time camera stream or something pointed right at it. And I would be able to like track that back to like a piece of land.
Yeah.
And then in the other direction, I actually might go out and buy a plot of land, put it into your system somehow, and then go back and feed someone else like me and say, hey, look, I got this plot of land that had I was going to have a Walmart go up or something. And I managed to like buy it instead. How do I plug in? So maybe just fill us in on those two sides.
Yeah. So both of these are things that our solutions can help enable, but that the current status quo doesn't support at all. So I guess I can talk a little bit about like how this works without us, which is that when you have a new plot of land that you want to turn into a carbon project, people have to go there, measure all the trees. And to some extent, that kind of thing still needs to happen because we have to be sure that the kinds of trees are what they say they are. But then they have to do that again every 5 years to make sure the trees are still there. So that's the monitoring step, which it often is less frequent than every 5 years. It could be every 30 years. Or you can just be taking like the landholder's word for it. So our justification is that we use remote sensing to monitor that. So after the initial step of being like, the trees are this kind of tree, then we can continue to monitor consistently using satellites. So it's not quite a live stream, although we have talked about doing that for certain places where it'd be very cool and more accessible to do. With satellites, you can continually monitoring all these places. It's not quite as detailed as a live stream, but it's still like a frequent update, probably about monthly, have high quality data. Can't do it too much more frequently than that for a lot of them because of things like cloud cover.
So one of my challenges I have when I look at sites like this and I think, okay, I'm going to buy some offset, they'll point me typically to like some big, huge plot of land, and maybe I see some pictures of it, but I don't actually know what I own, right? Yeah. What is it I'm buying, and how do I wrap my head around it as opposed to just being pointed to a picture of a forest?
Yeah, so it is a little bit more abstract because you're buying a credit. And part of the reason that we talk about it in those terms is because then you can more easily compare forests of super different types. Mm-hmm. And also the piece I mentioned about like the risk to the forest, meaning even if like two forests have the same biomass per hectare, if one of them is at much greater risk of deforestation, you're going to need to actually protect more hectares of that land as a buffer against that risk. And so we can't just say for X number of dollars, you've protected Y amount of land, because it's going to vary greatly depending on what land it is. You're completely right that people want to see the degree of specificity. So that's a continual, I think, challenge on our like marketing side of the storytelling piece of how do you translate this kind of abstract thing into something that is compelling to people.
Let's dig into both those sides. On the risk side, you said something really interesting, like, okay, so for a given plot of land, you have to somehow assess its risk of basically not being a carbon sink.
Yeah.
And how do you quantify that risk?
There are industry standards of like how much buffer you need to apply, and then the frequency of monitoring, which does allow things to slip through the cracks sometimes. So we increase the frequency of monitoring so that if a forest from which credits have been issued gets destroyed, we can notify more quickly. And that will lead to reissuing, either redrawing project boundaries, meaning protecting different land or something, or ceasing to issue credits, or like shifting where that money has gone. It can go to all kinds of things. And this is an industry that's continuously changing, meaning like if a forest burns down, maybe the land still needs to be protected because that land can still regrow.
Let's say you've got an acre of land inside one of the California forests that burned this summer. Okay. Mm-hmm. So for that acre of land, do you associate that specifically with a certain number of credits?
Yeah.
And then once it burns down, do you delete those credits?
It will really depend on like the specifics of what has happened. So when we're modeling biomass, we're looking at how much is actually in the trees at a given time. Mm-hmm. But what we're looking at it to assess is like trends and differences between the protected land versus unprotected land. Because as long as a tree is alive, the biomass is in that tree. But when the tree dies, that biomass, is released into the atmosphere through decomposition or burning. But if it's a protected forest, the total carbon of that stand of trees should remain constant. If an ecosystem can recover, the carbon credits are still valid in the sense that we're not protecting any specific tree, we're protecting an ecosystem. But if it gets to a point where the ecosystem itself is destroyed, then that's different. So like a fire that comes through burning super hot and like obliterates things is very different from a fire that comes through and thins the trees and they can come back healthily. Like that's some of the complexity in like this monitoring piece. But the biggest aspect that we're looking at often is actually just deforestation.
Tell me, pre-AI, what exactly happened?
Like the very fundamental level of it is like destructive sampling.
Okay.
You'll take a tree and burn it in a special sensor to come up with the carbon that's destroyed.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Obviously can't do that at scale because that is exactly the opposite of what
that's the wrong thing to do.
So from there, they can derive what are called allometric equations, which basically are just pretty simple, like matching equations to like fit that measurement to measurements of trees. And you can go based on like tree density and size. And so those equations will be derived for tree species, for tree like locations. There are tons of different ones. There's a lot in the literature about like which one you should be using. And generally you want to use as specific as you can to what you have, like what kind of tree, both the species and the location. And they only take into account often the above ground biomass, but sometimes they also include the roots. Sometimes you also need to somehow take into account the other biomass in the forest beyond the trees. But basically you go in, you'll do an inventory, measure all the trees, plug that into the allometric equation, pick the correct equation, add the corrective factors for whether the equation is taking into account things other than above ground biomass in trees. And then you get a number, and that's the biomass for some area. And so it's very manual and very time consuming, and there's a lot of room for error. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we face in applying machine learning to this, is that ground truth data is not that clean. And it's also very expensive to collect. So it's not a place like, you can just go scrape the entire internet and train GPT-3 on this.
I'm guessing it's not standardized either. Like different governments hire probably independent consultants or something that do this sort of thing.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of different data sets and a lot of trying to understand the characteristics of those data sets. And from there, figuring out if we need to apply different corrective factors and how do we use it and how much do we trust it. And then another big difficulty is that a lot of the time, the sampling is done in healthy forests, and governments will want to understand what their old growth forests are like. And so they'll go in and do all these measurements there, which means then when we're trying to model, a second growth forest or new planting, it's very difficult because we don't have that much data that reflects it, since the expensive high quality data tends to be from national parks and things like that.
So are you mostly buying the data?
So a lot of our data is from government sources, so we don't have to buy it, but we do have to get access to it, which can take some work. Lots of universities have some experimental forests. We do buy some data, but that actually tends to be our satellite data that we buy. Usually we can get access to tree measurement data through partnerships and things. And I know definitely where this is going. We're going to have to start collecting our own data. But at this point, we haven't yet begun doing that.
And tell me a little bit about, walk us through the modeling process. Are you directly straight up trying to predict the targets that are coming out of this?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that have been tried. And the kind of industry standard approach for this is to use LiDAR as the input where you have LiDAR, which is not everywhere. So LiDAR is basically point cloud data that describes in 3D the shape of something. It's often used in self-driving cars. In this case, it's for forests. But yeah, that can be either spaceborne or airborne. And we have played around with both. Again, spaceborne, you're going to get it in more places, but it's going to be less fine-grained versus from a drone, you can get really high resolution, but in very specific places. So there are trade-offs. So the standard is to use that as your input and then predict biomass from that. This means that you can usually get very high quality maps for places where you have good LiDAR data, because the LiDAR data is essentially giving you the inputs to those allometric equations I mentioned, right? It's telling you the tree measurements. That's what the LiDAR data can do. But the downside is, like I mentioned, you may not have it everywhere. And so then people will tend to use just optical satellite imagery as an input and then predict biomass from that. And then you can train corrective models between these. So basically, you'll be able to get a biomass model in more places based on optical imagery as your input, but it won't be as good because the imagery can't capture all the things you want it to. And you're not just using the way the images look to the human eye. You're often using ratios between the bands that are known scientifically to capture information about plants or about soil moisture and so on. We also use various other inputs that are not direct captures from the time we're observing. So this might be weather observations over a long period of time so that we know basic climatic information about where we're trying to predict the biomass, because that can tell us about basically the potential. And a model trained just on those things can give you a pretty good estimate of biomass. It can't tell you anything specific about the current time. It'll just tell you if there was a super healthy forest here, how much biomass might it have? And that kind of thing can help the model quite a bit.
You're listening to Your AI Injection, brought to you by Xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com. Check out our website for more content, or if you need help injecting AI into your organization. So help me wrap my head around this. So like if I'm looking at LiDAR data of a rainforest, I'm basically just able to tell that it's a rainforest. Is the model really learning like the girth of particular trees and all that? Or are you ultimately relying on these samples that you actually kind of rigorously manually measured?
So it depends on how granular the LiDAR imagery is and the amount of like the processing applied often does, like in the process of rasterizing this point cloud, you often end up with it being like resampled to a much lower resolution. So like larger pixel size, which means you're right. You can't tell as much detail, but the raw point cloud can have tons of information. Like I've seen images where you can see like the shapes of every single layer in like a cedar tree or something. And if you have both the enough data and the data at all and enough compute and, all the labels you would need to use that data, you could potentially have extremely high performance LiDAR models. The issue is always just having enough of the data, both the target, which is the biomass of a tree. Like if you can't geolocate your LiDAR imagery and your labels, that is like the biomass measurement finely enough, then it's not useful, right? So that's part of why you would smooth it out a little bit, because that way, even if you get the tree offset by a few meters, you still know the tree is in that the couple meter area, and then you can use it. But the biomass is so highly concentrated in the very large trees that it works out.
Is that ultimately what this comes down to, is counting the large trees?
It's not quite that simple, since that wouldn't allow you to capture things like regrowth and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I think that's definitely a big part of it. It can be really astonishing when we're looking at there've been a couple of times when I first started working on this kind of project where I would look at our labels and be like, but this couple square meter section, that's an impossible number. And then our forest science expert would be like, no, that's just where the old growth tree is. Like that number is so huge compared to all the things around it because there's one giant tree, So the outliers contain a lot of the biomass.
So, at the end of the day, like how accurate is it?
That is the $1 million question. The level of uncertainty captured in all of these steps is so high. Basically, the thing we look for in accuracy is matching up with the existing state of the art, which, as I mentioned earlier, the measurements through the allometric equations and the destructive testing, even that has a lot of error. So we want to match that as well as we can. And then what we really want to do is look at trends. So we want to make sure that if our model that detects deforestation is detecting deforestation, that our biomass model is correctly saying that biomass has been lost. If we run this thing over, a forest that we know is second growth versus old growth, we want to be sure that it's getting the correct trends. So basically, you want to be sure that all of the trends are matching up, and then that the influence of those environmental potential variables are correctly being reflected. Like we want to be sure that we're not just predicting based on potential. And as long as all of those things are happening, then the model is pretty trustworthy. But all of those things are very hard to match up with.
But you must have been able to measure your stuff on a very particular scenario.
Yeah, we have accuracy bars that we require ourselves to meet before we can say that the model is good enough to use for evaluating a project. Basically, we have all these field plots, all these measurements, all this LiDAR data, all of this optical data, all of this radar data, which I didn't even mention, but sometimes we use that too. Mm-hmm. And all of these things. And then ultimately we need to be able to build a model and then run it somewhere else, because the places where we have these measurements are not the places that we're concerned about, right? Because we're looking for the potential new reforestation places or new protected existing forests, not the places that have already been investigated really heavily. So we want to be able to determine, is the model good enough to run in this specific place? So that's the other factor. You can't just say the model is this good, because running on a test split that comes out of your training data, which is pretty standard practice. That doesn't work very well for this kind of model because everything is very spatially autocorrelated, which means if you just take a chunk of your training set and use it, you can get really amazing numbers, but they don't really necessarily mean anything if the forest that you need to evaluate isn't spatially autocorrelated with your training data. There's a lot of basically just a whole lot of plots that we need to inspect to look at the trends in all these different ways to assess whether we can trust any of the quantitative numbers that we're getting, because that qualitative assessment is still a huge part of determining whether the models are viable.
So from a customer standpoint, I mean, it might be depending on the customer, but like, you've got end consumers and you have corporations who might have quite exacting standards. But bottom line is, if some cattle farmer in Botswana agreed to reforest their land, you're going to know when they started sneaking their cows back on. Do you feel like as of today, you're able to satisfy those stakeholders, or do you feel like you're at the very beginning of a very long road, or kind of both? Or
I definitely think it's both. Like there are places in the world for which we have sufficient data and experience to be able to do this well. And there are places that we don't yet. We're definitely in a really exciting place because of that fact. Like the fact that we know we can do it, but we haven't yet is really exciting. And most of what we do right now is building on top of existing carbon registries, which means someone else using a more traditional approach has already verified the project, and we are doing an additional step of verification. We don't accept all projects from all registries. I don't know our rejection level, but it's pretty high. There's a lot of projects that we take into consideration, and then we determine the amount of verification that has already happened is not sufficient. So our standards, because we're able to apply this more frequent monitoring and more detailed monitoring, are seeing problems with things. We try to give that feedback back to project developers so people can improve. And then our next step, what we're really working towards next year and starting now, is our own projects, which we will like co-evaluate rather than being a secondary step.
Do you have like a region where you're going to track carbon, and therefore you have to kind of keep going with your data and your sampling and everything you need to do until you reach a point where you're confident in the analysis? And at that point, the next unit of land becomes sort of accessible to your customers and transparent and everything. And now it's being monitored properly. And now your team moves on to the next, plot of land. Is that in essence the way you work?
Right now we're not doing it in as orderly a fashion as that. We tend to kind of go where the data is and where the projects are, rather than us being like, here's an area we want to roll out. I have heard talk that's something we want to start doing. And as we scale, hopefully we'll be able to. But for now, it's like we have this great data set that some university is willing to let us use, or some other researcher met somebody at a conference and is going to like let us use their data, and then we can build a cool model for somewhere that we previously couldn't. Or we'll have a large company be like, hey, we want to support forest projects close to our headquarters. And do you have any? And we don't. And so we find one and we have to verify it, which means we've got to find data, like that kind of thing. And I don't know like the level of specificity that goes into like all of those decisions, but definitely for now, it's like finding data and projects, both.
Pretty much describes almost every machine learning project out there. Like we all do that all the time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's just different in your case because it actually, it actually translates into something interesting like forests and on the ground and whatever.
I guess what makes it feel different to me is that it's like physical place. I literally mean, where is the data? Like geographically.
Yeah. No, I think it's actually funny because, as data scientists, we're so comfortable in the non-real world, like in this abstract intellectual land. Here's a weird question. Have you thought about tapping into private landowners? You've got apps or something and you walk your property and maybe you actually tap into them somehow as users to actually generate stats for you so that you don't have to, go off and send, highly probably what are expensive teams to go to take measurements and stuff.
So if you want to ask, have you thought about doing this cool thing with forests? We definitely have.
Gotcha.
Most of them, but like, some of the new iPhones have LiDAR in them.
Right.
How cool would it be to have, citizen science teams go out and do that? And then of course our forest science expert will be like, citizen science can be dangerous. People can do things wrong, like there's so many cool things, and there's so much satellite data that we don't yet use, and we could do things with it. And I can't even explain how many cool projects and problems there are still in this space to solve. And for now, we're just doing forests, but like grassland also captures carbon, and algae does. Like maybe we could do that kind of thing. We have no plans for any of these yet, but the possibilities are endless here.
I totally appreciate, your forest experts saying that sending out, individuals has got its own set of problems, but isn't that kind of what always happens with machine learning? Like there's different levels of, it's rarely the case where you can just go out and get easy ground truth. Those problems, if they're intersected with value, tend to have already been taken up. You can just measure efficacy of your humans as well as you can measure the efficacy of your models. So you could, you really do have so many people that really want to do something about the state of the planet right now. If you organize teams, they go out, they take measurements, then you could measure them against your actual ground truth. And you could.
I think that if we could, develop an uncertainty model of the humans collecting the data.
Exactly.
That's a theoretical thing that could be done. There's truly like unlimited number of cool projects that could be done with the fact that we can collect more data.
What does the demand for your credits look like?
Right now, I think we're more bound by supply than demand, actually, because we're kind of in this new space of this high frequency and high fidelity monitoring of this. A lot of projects don't yet pass our bar. It's definitely a matter of, there are more big companies mostly who want to be spending money on real carbon offsets, and it's hard to find enough. We need to, tap into this market before they get frustrated and go away. And also we need to, for the planet's sake, most people at Pachama are just like the people who want to protect forests for any reason, even if the money wasn't involved. But like, that's not the world we live in. We need to find ways to direct money to these projects so that they will happen.
The scale of this problem is daunting, right? It's just daunting. And the time scale within which we have to solve it is comparably daunting. One question I had for you is, these corporate buyers, are they the ones that are like pushing you for like higher and higher efficacy in your modeling practice and your quantification of the carbon that's actually being offset for a particular area?
Yeah. I won't say no, because I think they definitely do have teams that are pushing on that. I know some in specific who have like very specific ideas of how they want us to do this, but more what I feel on the machine learning side is the, university or government entities putting out papers in the field, who we need to look at what they're doing and compare ourselves to them and see if our stuff matches. Sometimes those will be on more tractable problems because they will, they're not trying to do just anywhere. They usually have a specific data set they're trying to model, but we need to be able to match their performance, at least if we have that. And we need to be able to explain why we can't, if we can't, that kind of thing. So that's where I personally really feel it in my work, but I think it's coming from all sides. A lot of governments are working on very similar problems. And also, there are both voluntary and government-run credit markets. And I don't know what kinds of standards are being enforced within the government ones. But a lot of the papers that we're reading are coming out of people who are in government positions.
For the sake of our listeners and me, frankly, because I don't know the stories at all, but tell me, how do the carbon markets work? What's the equivalent of the NASDAQ and the Dow, and what are you buying? And are there ETF equivalents? And how does that whole thing work?
It's simultaneously like a Wild West and also extremely monitored. Everyone playing in the field is super invested in it being real and wanting it to work. but there isn't like a single entity, like the equivalent of
the SEC or something.
Yeah, that's monitoring it all. And so there's lots of big players, like the one that I have followed the longest, I guess, is Vera. They don't do things that are technically similar to us, but we piggyback off of a lot of their more manual work, and they've been working in this area for a really long time. And then, of course, not all carbon credits are nature-based, like we're talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
That are green energy projects, all kinds of things. And so that's a whole other can of worms of how much carbon emissions are being avoided through that kind of project. And there are other organizations and probably companies trying to make that more legit. But like the whole thing is just a need that is not being filled. But to what your point about, like, is there equivalent of like ETFs? There can be bundles where, and this is something that we sell, is like, rather than buying what you were envisioning initially, like a very specific thing, it's more like, here's a chunk of money, get me some carbon credits with it. So some companies will be really specific about who they want to support, whether that's location or type of forest, whether some people are very particular about whether they want reforestation or avoided deforestation. And I guess it's like an aesthetic choice. I don't know. The more balanced portfolio would be to be doing some of each in different parts of the world, because they all have different kinds of risks and different kinds of uncertainties. And if you diversify, you're probably doing better.
I mean, I get the idea of companies offsetting and buying these credits, but are they selling them too? And, are there investors trying to buy a certain type of credit?
I don't know.
If the demand is low and the price starts spiking, at the end of the day, that's going to translate into more dollars available to, some rancher somewhere to. As
long as it does actually, like, it doesn't just involve a bunch of money, like ticket scalper style going into the wrong person's pocket rather than the creator. It's definitely possible. That would be good. I think the real fear is that prices inflate, and then the things that were being speculated on end up being not very high quality credits. And then there are big, scary headlines around that. An industry as unregulated as this one, there are a lot of things that are not being properly vetted, or even people are attempting, but don't know what they're doing, that kind of thing.
And you want transparency around the credit. And you're basically saying, look, this credit connects with this forest, which has this, audit trail behind it, and this commitment to a future trail behind it. So you're basically validating the worth of that credit in essence.
That's exactly what we are doing. And we just hope that we can scale that up to meet the level of need. And that's, I think, why supply and demand is really weird to talk about in here, because ultimately we keep coming back to, like, obviously the supply and demand matter for us as a company, but they don't matter for the world. The world needs this, whether there's supply or demand. And as the big biodiversity, carbon is only one of our big problems that this kind of solution can solve. Like, switching to using a carbon credit that involves switching to green energy doesn't address the biodiversity crisis, whereas nature-based carbon credits do.
Yeah. I mean, you could imagine a world where, let's say you're wildly successful, these credits are worth a lot and they increase in value. And so much so that people, instead of cutting down a region or leaving it alone and allowing it to maintain its biodiversity, start planting the densest trees imaginable in the most dense fashion imaginable, in which case, like, no living species care about it. But that would still be effective. There
are definitely ways things can be done poorly. And that's why it's important that we have that final step of, like, it passes all of our carbon checks, but does it also have other good side effects? You don't want just like a giant tree plantation to be the only thing that you ever are growing. Because a tree plantation is better than a strip mall, but it's not as good as it could be. So if that land could otherwise be developed in a better way.
Yeah, I think ecosystems aren't optimized for carbon extraction. It's maybe a factor that happens to be.
I mean, I do think there are many places, and I'm not an expert on this part, but it seems from what I've seen that in a lot of cases, if you let the forest manage itself or let indigenous communities manage the forest, it does better than like what we would guess would be the best. Because if you grow it super dense, it often will have higher rates of disease, be at greater risk of forest fire. And so the thing that short-term optimizing for just carbon isn't actually going to optimize for, a 50-year scale carbon.
So tell me, like, what are the big AI problems, taking it back to the machine learning side, what are the big AI problems in this space that you think represent the next 5 to 10 years of effort?
I think we are going to continue to get more different kinds of satellites. And like, that's inevitable. There are so many satellites being launched all the time. Finding how to integrate that information and use it productively for this project. Like in my dream world, we would have both enough satellite information and enough like labeled data to be able to model biomass at like a total scale, like everywhere. I don't think that's impossible. I think it's definitely possible. I don't know how likely it is because I don't think it's a priority. I mean, when you launch a satellite, they're often like telecommunications. They don't have this kind of camera on board. Even the ones that do are not always, fully available. But I definitely think that's a thing that could happen, and it'd be super cool if it did. I also think expanding the same general technology that is currently being used, so less pie in the sky, is taking the current approaches and just finding ways to correctly and forever improving how we monitor the risk. Because like I mentioned, there's an uncertainty. There's all the things that can hurt a forest and all the things that we don't know and all of the messiness in our labeled data. So if we can come up with clever ways of understanding all of the places where that breaks down, like we mentioned before, some theoretical model to tell how bad the people were at getting the data, then we could get more data, right? If we knew that. And so I'm sure there are ways we can plug in more things.
So here's a question that this one popped in my head. I was driving through rural Botswana, and I just can't help but wonder for that one farmer who's going to burn down that 1 acre of land, like what is the dollar cost of that acre of land and, to that farmer? Because a lot of these folks are not super wealthy people. Yeah. It just doesn't seem like it's that expensive for us to, take your carbon credit valuation, figure out what that stuff's worth, maybe price in some biodiversity, value in there, and have it so the rest of us are buying these things on the wealthy side of the world, and that farmer is literally just getting paid to not cut down their forest.
Yeah, so I think that's like, democratization of carbon credits is a big part of it. Like right now, a lot of the projects that are running on the major registries are pretty big because that's what makes sense economically when you have to go inspect them. But if we can get to a point where we can do this using a fully remote sensing model, we could be assessing the value of the land right next to one farmer's property and offering him whatever amount and giving him the skills and the incentive to protect it. And I think it's made easier by the fact that a lot of these people already do love that land just as much as, a tourist up there, and they don't want to have to cut it down. But when given a choice between eating and not, like, it's not a fair position that we put people in.
So how far away do you think that time is where, your team can go into a map of the world, draw boundaries around areas that you're dying to protect, and then price that land and route cash to those folks and just literally buy the forestry rights or whatever?
Yeah. I suspect it will vary a lot by location in the world, both based on having government support for that sort of thing and community support. Like if it's in a place where we have been able to establish trust, that kind of thing will go in more quickly. And this was something that was talked about by some of the protesters at COP26 last week, was about this whole issue of it's like colonialism, the rich countries coming in and telling indigenous communities, don't cut your forest down, we're going to give you money. And no one is actually doing that yet, really, because it's not technically feasible, but it is a thing that's being proposed and it's a thing that needs to happen. But it seems like to them on the ground, a bunch of Western people who know nothing about their land showing up and telling them, don't cut this forest down. I mean, why should they trust that we actually know anything? Why should
I'm saying like literally they download an app, they walk the perimeter of their property, they take their iPhone, they shoot some LiDAR imagery, and then they put in their bank account and they press a button that says, here, you get a monthly payment.
I think that it's a thing that can happen and that we will be able to reach a point where people are comfortable with that. But to a lot of the people who currently are the ones closest to this land, they're the least involved in this whole world of global finance. They're like, why should I give you my bank account information? You're going to take all my money.
It's like that for a little while, but as soon as their buddy gets $100 a month, they're going to go do it.
Getting to that point is going to be harder than we want it to be. And I also think there is room for exploitation here that we need to make sure that we steer clear of. Because anytime you're talking about wealthy people trying to influence the behavior of less wealthy people, you're in a dangerous place. And even though in this case, we're all well-intentioned, there are going to be bad actors. And we just need to make sure that we catch them quickly before they hurt anyone.
Cool.
And I think it's very important. And I think that we have room to make the world and people's lives a lot better. We just have to make sure we actually do.
So I think this has been a totally enlightening conversation for me. I feel like I understand this whole carbon credit arena, better than I before. So I want to thank you a ton for that. I want to end with a question that I suppose is on everybody's minds who's following COP26 and what's going to happen? Are we really going to get our shit together and save the world or not?
Man, I wish I knew. I feel like, so when I took this job, I was like, I'm either going to feel way better because I'm going to be spending all of my time trying to solve this problem, or I'm going to feel way worse because I'm going to never be able to avoid hearing news about it. And I think it's really been both. The news is often bad, but not always. There is progress. There are major companies who at this point are doing this because they want to, because they feel the consumer pressure to invest in offsetting their emissions, including a lot of companies who are offsetting their historical emissions, which is
wow.
Huge. And a lot of,
even wanting to do that is good.
Yeah, there's a lot of critiques that I've heard that are like, well, isn't this just a license to emit more? Not if they're going back 50 or 100 years and offsetting all of their emissions.
Oh, yeah. Can you imagine if Shell and Chevron and Exxon did that? I mean, that's amazing.
Amazing. So it's very cool. And there is progress happening. It remains to be seen whether it's fast enough. I think we're at the point now where we have to be honest with ourselves and be like, anything we do is better than doing nothing, but I don't think we're going to be able to do enough. I mean, we're already seeing the effects of climate change. We're not going to be able to undo the heat wave that happened last summer and killed people, right? It already happened. It's already here, but we can do more than we're currently doing. And hopefully we will.
Oh, a lot more. Oh my God. I know. And it's so real. I mean, literally 3 days ago, we had these massive floods in Bellingham and Vancouver and Abbotsford. And my best friend in the world's got a pump and he's just going into friends' houses and pumping out basements.
Yeah.
Insane.
I saw all these people marking themselves as safe from the flooding. Yeah.
We both sadly know that, in another 2 months, there's going to be another something somewhere.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to go down the dark side because I really want to focus on how much awesome work you guys are doing. Yeah. What can regular people do? Maybe this is the final note. What can our audience do today? Can they go somewhere and offset some credits and immediately do something?
I mean, it's a constant debate I'm having with myself too, right? Individuals can offset their carbon emissions. I think a big thing is if you're at a corporation, push for them to do it too. Our website does support individuals purchasing, but our main focus is on companies. Just because so much bigger, individual transactions are pretty small, but they're super important. I see them coming in all the time. So yeah, go offset your carbon. But just more than that, be aware that it's a societal level shift that needs to happen, and be the person in your social circle encouraging everybody else to make whatever changes they can. Google now will tell you which route on Google Maps is going to emit more CO2, or which flight you purchase is likely to be more efficient. Like, pay attention to those things. Look at them the same way you would like spending money, because you are spending the carbon budget and we are already over budget.
That's all for this episode. I'm Deep Dillon, your host, saying check back soon for your next AI injection. In the meantime, if you need help injecting AI into your business, reach out to us at zyonix.com. That's XYONIX.com. Whether it's text, audio, video, or other business data, we help all kinds of organizations like yours automatically find and operationalize transformative insights.